My paper is called The Garbage of Society, Disposable Women and the Socio Spatial Scripts of Femicide in Guatemala. I wrote this paper because I wanted to explore the processes of meaning-making around femicide. Although definitions of the term vary by geography, discipline, and sector, broadly speaking, femicide or feminicide refers to the gender-related killing of women, which often culminates in socially and politically tolerated murder. In Guatemala, thousands of femicides have been committed in the aftermath of the country's genocidal civil war, which transpired between 1960 and 1996. More than 20 years into the post-war period, themes concerning violence and insecurity remain markedly prominent across the national political and social landscape. And woven within the broader assemblage of discursive and governance practices that respond to and attempt to account for this violence in Guatemala is a field of representation for femicide and its victims. Widely circulated national newspapers report stories of violence and femicide almost daily, providing the public with often sensationalized information about the victims and their killers, and advancing theories about the motive for the violence and what should be done about it. The problem with mainstream media reporting on femicide is not one of visibility as such. Instead, it is the nature of that visibility and how it intersects with the state's response to violence that my paper calls into question. In particular, my paper explores the ways in which media representations and state responses to femicide are structured by gendered and racialized dynamics which are deeply entwined with the country's historical and ongoing practices of violence and dispossession. Drawing upon Butlerian epistemologies of violence and indigenous and feminist scholarship from Guatemala and the Americas, I argue that space and embodiment are key nodes through which representations of femicide are disciplined, and relatedly, through which distinctions between victims of the country's far-reaching violence get re-articulated. My paper draws upon multiple sources: a discourse analysis of the most widely circulated national newspaper, Prensa Libre's, reporting on femicide, alongside an analysis of the state's regulatory framework for violence during General Otto Pérez Molina's tenure as president and leader of the Patriot Party. I supplement this analysis with interviews and ethnographic observations from fieldwork conducted in Guatemala between 2013 and 2015. Examining Prensa Libre's coverage of violence during this research, I noticed that the ways in which femicide were represented was highly discrepant upon how victims emerged socio-spatially. Specifically, I noticed that discursive references to where a victim's body was found and to who was alleged to have murdered her seemed to be communicating something more broadly about her social status and value. For victims whose bodies were described as having been discovered in a ravine, a motel, a ditch next to a highway, or a zone of Guatemala City identified as quote unquote insecure or as a gang neighborhood, the public spatiality of their deaths and who and what this spatiality symbolically connected them to delegitimized them as victims. This was particularly true when compared to select domestic violence femicides that were framed in the media as high-impact cases, or casos de alto impacto in Spanish. I refer to the latter as private femicides. These public spatial references, on the other hand, mobilized a host of assumptions about victims' low social status and undesirable social circles, what I refer to in my paper as social circle failure. To that end, I show that the notion that public femicide victims are disposable unfolds because their bodies and their location are read in relation to two socio-spatial figures who serve as reference points that generate meaning about public victims' social circles, social status, and ultimately lack of worth. The first of these figures is a marero, or a gang member who is linked to a discourse around urban violence and insecurity. The second, a mother and housewife, is linked to a discourse around domestic violence and quote-unquote safe families. These two frameworks saturated the discursive field around violence during Molina's tenure, which lasted between 2012 and 2015. Ultimately, I argue that public bodies and spaces are prefigured as disposable through reactivated historical scripts of violence and the attendant gendered and racialized imaginaries that assign stigma and value according to victims' perceived social status. While neither femicide nor the representations I track in my paper are entirely new or specific to the Patriot Party's governance, President Molina himself was the head of the Guatemalan Army's Joint Chiefs of Staff during the 1980s, when the country's civil war turned genocidal. His administration thus provides a unique entry point into the ways in which the violence of settler colonial states does not end, but rather evolves and endures through genocidal civil wars and peacetime dispossession. By unpacking the socio-spatial logics informing how and why bodies matter in Guatemala, this paper contributes a scholarly account of the intertwined geographies of corporeality and violence. More broadly, it emphasizes the productive work of states and powerful institutions like the news media in normalizing femicide, reinforcing social hierarchies between victims, and bolstering the broader permission structures that enable widespread impunity for gender-based violence. I hope that my paper catalyzes further research by critical feminist geographers into the exclusionary logics that can accompany scripts of femicide and violence more broadly in other contexts. Future research might explore, for example, the socio-spatial scripts of gender-based violence that circulate in immigration policy debates about who is considered a legitimate victim of violence and why. I think that such inquiries will be necessary across discursive landscapes where references to violence of any kind can actually lend themselves to logics that further embed exclusion. Practically speaking, the effect of the representations I track in my paper is that many femicide victims are dehumanized to the point where they are not considered true victims. And this has implications beyond the realm of media representation to that of the state's legal and policy response. References to gang violence or sex workers, for example, not only perpetrate harmful stereotypes about some of the most marginalized women in Guatemala, but also against some of the most marginalized young men, who are represented as a monolithic group of violent criminals. And as in-country activists pointed out, the practice of printing explicit images of cadavers in newspapers widens an already significant empathy gap for femicide victims who are considered of low social status. These dynamics feed into a broader problem: impunity. While the public's focus is trained on the social and moral worth of individual victims and their social circles, institutional failures to prevent and respond to femicides go unaddressed. From a policy standpoint, then, I hope that this paper catalyzes a broader conversation about the concrete steps that can be taken in Guatemala and beyond to change reporting practices so that they illuminate rather than obscure the root causes of gender-based violence. To that end, I have published a short policy brief through the research consultancy Ladysmith to accompany my Antipode publication. You can find the link to that brief in the description for this video. Thank you.